Well, hello there, guys. Welcome back to the Noob DM channel. I know it's been quite a while since I dropped a video, and I apologize. Things have not really been pretty active for me on the gaming scene until just recently. What I mean is, I have been playing Dungeons and Dragons as my primary RPG, especially at the store in the usual game store in my neighborhood. Um, so that hasn't changed, but I haven't really had any new experiences until today. And today, I got the chance to DM a session for the first time over at the community center, community library, and I had a pretty good turnout. I had a session prepared, and I was thinking maybe if I'm lucky, if I was lucky, I would get 3 or 4 people to show up. But it turned out to be a full session with about 6 players, and so it gave me quite the opportunity to my try out session and try out my budding noob DM skills. And the whole purpose of this channel was sort of to chronicle my getting back into D&D specifically and talk about some of the gaming experiences and as I accrue more experience running sessions and maybe to pass on some tips, pass on some advice to people. I know there's a number of channels already that do this and they do it fairly well, and I might put a link to the subscription there. But having my own personal experiences, I think is still valid, and I think people can learn from some of the things I have learned. And one thing I will say is that for this specific video, I wanted to go ahead and talk about some of the things that I have experienced players do while playing the fifth edition of the game. I want to talk about younger players and how they approach role playing, which I think is kind of interesting and a fascinating aspect to the fifth edition that we currently have. And I also wanted to talk about the propensity for opening up race and class combinations. I've noticed that I'm coming from an old school tradition. In second edition, for example, there were a lot of restrictions in terms of not necessarily the mechanics, although there were some restrictions in mechanics, but I'm talking about more of racial and class combinations. So I had this whole session prepared, and I took the adventure that everybody uses initially when they're new, which is a fantastic adventure for the starter set, and I kind of tailored it, gave it my own personal spin, and kind of combined it with some homebrew aspects for the game. And I had originally intended to have all the players show up and use a pre-generated character. Although I'm not so fond of pre-gens because I think people should have a choice to. I think half the fun of playing Dungeons and Dragons and similar like Pathfinder and RPGs and those type of tabletop RPGs is creating your own character, rolling your stats. I don't really like the point buy system or some of these other builds, fast build. I think part of the fun is rolling your own stats because I think it connects you in a visceral way to your character. And so what ended up happening this first session that I just ran earlier today, was that we had people um, about let's say about half of the players they were okay with they didn't know how to build characters, they were brand new, so they were okay with playing pre-generated characters, and that saved some time. But the other half was a little bit more experienced and they wanted to play characters, and I found it really interesting that they wanted to play more creatures as opposed to humans. And that's not something new. That's been happening for a while. I think I've encountered people playing different type of race class combinations since fourth edition, and fifth edition kind of welcomes this where they will have it more wide open. For example, as you can see here in my background, this starter campaign heavily involves goblins, but we did have and the players had no knowledge beforehand what I was going to run, but we did have a player that wanted to roll up a goblin character as a playover character, and the first question he asked me is, was it okay to use a creature rather than the standard race class combination. And of course, I thought about it for a while, and I was like, if you can tailor it and you get the stats ready to go, then I don't see a problem with that. And we had somebody else play another fantasy creature that was out of the norm. Um, and we were playing in the standard setting, which is the Forgotten Realms and the fifth edition standard setting, like Neverwinter, uh, uh, the Sword Coast, Faerun, the Sword Coast, that environment. But you don't see a lot of some of these other races or combinations of other races in the game. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that today because that is one big part of the experience that I had. And I wanted to ask you guys who have more experience running your own games in fifth edition, whether you've encountered this a lot. What do you allow the characters to play? Um, Unusual, let's say unorthodox, or more out of the box type race and class combinations, such as a goblin. We had today a player using a goblin as a PC, and I believe it was a goblin. Well, I can't remember the class, but it was definitely a goblin. And and then we had another player who wanted to play a satyr. As far as I know, satyrs are not very common in the Forgotten Realms. I could be wrong. It's been a while since I've kind of had run a campaign myself, so that was interesting. And she ended up playing a satyr who was a who was from the wilderness or out of the rural areas, out of the it wasn't in Never, even though that we set the initial campaign in Neverwinter, or the first stage of the campaign with Neverwinter. Her character was out of the area, up on the mountainside and traveling down to the city, to the inn where everybody else was. And I thought that was really interesting. So what I'll do is compare some of the stats and some of the player characters that are not traditional, and we'll go from there. All right. It is very warm, very hot in the early summer season here in Northern California. Usually we have cool weather, but now in the second or third, maybe fourth official day of summer, where we have high temperatures, and it's like 100. Well, the thermometer in the car said 114, but I think it had been sitting in the sun for a while, and so I had to get some hydration in order to continue this video. All right, so excuse me for that. Now we're ready to talk about goblins as player characters because, as I mentioned, today's campaign. A player requested to have a goblin as a PC, and I was not prepared for that. I was like, I really had to think about it because I had the standard races. So one tip I can give you is if you're gonna have an open world, open campaign, and my opinion on that is I never want to limit the player's creativity or their imagination. And I could have easily said no. I'm the DM, and you're gonna play like a human cleric or something like that, and it would not have been a good idea because the player, even though this was a little more experienced, I think it was a new player, it might have been a different story altogether. But for someone that had obviously played a couple of games already, which was not the case for everybody else, he knew what he was doing in terms of character creation, and I just gave him the monster manual because I did not have a copy of Volo's guide. That's another thing. It's like the monsters and the creatures are all, it's a problem. It was a problem for the players. It's not so much a problem for Hasbro or Wizards of the Coast. It's not a problem for them at all because, the game company has to make money, so they sell the basics and then they sell game supplements such as Volo's Guide to Monsters and different bestiaries. But what before this year, where they streamlined all a good number of the monsters and put them all together in the Mordenkainen book, um, which is a gigantic bestiary, is all it is. Everything was really spread up. And so, but I do have a copy of Volos and other source books but I did not bring it with me because I did not expect that request. So I had a copy of the monster manual in case I had to come up with some encounters on the fly, and I also had a copy of the adventure module that homebrewed tailored that I was running with some adjustments. I wasn't running it straight from the box, and I also had, but that was it, you know. And then I had the pre-made characters that came with the box, and did not expect to be thrown a curveball by two of the players requesting to play some non-traditional player character race and class combinations. So if you look at the goblin, it is if you just look at the monster manual, which is what I was doing. I was like, here's the monster manual. Look up the creature that you want, and they just come up with the stats. It doesn't really. How close does it match with what we have in Volos? Because I looked it up later. I googled it later on and realized that there is a fifth edition playable class of Goblin in Volo's Guide to Monsters. But not knowing that, I just went ahead and said you can, you know, run it or get it straight from the monster manual. So the monster manual has all kinds of goblin creatures. It has a regular goblin, a boss. Well, actually, there's only two, so I take that back. Just a goblin and goblin. It's not a whole lot. I think there's more variety in other books. But be that as it may, the goblin is on page 166. Yeah, well, the lore starts on page 165 of the 5E Monster Manual, and then in 166 you have your regular stat blocks, and it has an armor class of 15 and 7 hit points, so it's kind of not that super powerful, and it has a strength of 8. Again, not very powerful. This is just a common. The main feature that it does have is that it has as +6 on stealth, so they're pretty stealthy creatures, and it's a challenge rating of 1/4, 1/4 CR, and has nimble escape and has a couple of other actions. So let's compare and see what we would get if we, just for the hell of it, let's compare what the character. This is what we ended up going with some adjustments to it. Um, in the absence of having knowing that we could have used Volos as a player to look up a playable race. So the Goblin is a playable race that you can use, and it is on page. See, uh, Goblin, Devastator. There's a number of goblins actually, but the goblinoids are on page 40 of Wallo's Guide to Monsters. And if we turn to that tome, you will see, um, bear with me while I turn to that page. Okay, goblins. Goblins, goblins, goblins. It gives you a whole bunch of lore on goblins, page 40 and page 41, and 42, and 43, and I don't know if it gives you actual stats for it. I don't see stats on the goblin. Let's see. Well, let me turn to the goblins on 161 and see if there's a stat blocks there, because I think that's all where I think that's where you find the stat blocks. Oh yes. So we have hobgoblins on page 161, and uh you have hobgoblins, and I don't see like a straight goblin. Kobolds, yeah. So maybe that they only have the hobgoblins and the goblinoids. This is what I mean. It's like basically we had to go with the monster manual goblin stats. So even though Volos does touch upon the goblin race, it doesn't really. It just goes into more of the sub races. Uh, it doesn't give you stats or a stat block, which we had to go and make it up on the fly. So I learned that was I didn't think that was going to be again that kind of threw me for a loop. And next, let's look at the Satyr, which I know is a playable race, but I don't know what book it's on, so I'll have to look that one up. All right, guys. So now we're looking at the Satyr. Um, this is the any flip. The Satyr happens to be the one in the one book that I don't own for fifth edition, which is the Mythic Odysseys of Theros. Mythic Odysseys of Theros is actually a Magic the Gathering setting book, but a lot of the I guess a lot of the creatures from Greek mythology, like satyrs and minotaurs, you can find them there. As and satyr is a playable race. Um, I do not I do not own this source book, but I do. So we again, and I wasn't expecting to get requests to play one, so I had to turn to the monster manual again, and there are some significant differences. Well, not significant, but there are some definite differences between the creature in the monster manual for 5e as well as opposed to like the Mythic Odysseys of Theros PC template. And for example, in the monster manual, you're able to ram, and this come up in the game where the character used his ram ability, um, and you can use the ram as a melee weapon attack, which gives a plus 3 bonus to hit one target, and you use six 2d4 plus one and the damage is 2d4 plus 1 bludgeoning damage. So that's one significant difference because if we look at the mythic mythic Odyssey's playable satyr, it talks about they're born of the wild. This is on page 24 and embracing life, and it kind of talks about the lore, but then you don't really get the stat block until the following page, which is page 26. So let's go there. And here you have the satyr traits. So basically, you get an ability score increase or charisma, which increases by 2, and your dexterity score increases by 1. And here you see that the ram ability, you can use your head and horns to make unarmed strikes. So it's still considered an unarmed strikes because you're not using a weapon, you're using your ram, your horns as a weapon. But if you hit with them, you deal bludgeoning damage equal to 1d4 plus your strength modifier. So it reverts or it changes from 1d6 to 1d4, and your strength modifier, which could make it a uh, more powerful attack if you use the satyr traits from the Mythic Odysseys book. And it does have magic resistance. The magic resistance is the same as the monster manual magic resistant creature, which is basically you have advantage on saving throws against spells and other magical effects. But um, it also talks about mirthful leaps, which I don't think is in the monster manual creature. Let me just take a quick look. No, I don't see them. So this is a brand new ability that you can use as a PC, I guess. Is whenever you make a long or high jump, you can roll a d8 and add the number rolled to one to the number of feet you cover. So basically, you can make big leaps. And Reveler, you have proficiency in the performance and persuasion skills with one musical instrument of your choice, which comes really handy out of the sheer coincidence, or maybe not a coincidence, maybe the player knew what they were doing, but they asked to be a bard. And so reveler traits and proficiency in performance and persuasions are the two, especially performance, will go a long way in if you're a bard character. So this is something that came up. So I think that if you're DMing, you should be aware that, especially because 5e has fewer restrictions than in terms of unusual, out of the box, or unorthodox, I want to say, um, race and class combination. In second edition, for example, you had limitations on your racial combination, and that is not the case for fifth edition. Very much. There's very few restrictions on what combos you can pick. Now, I don't think that's a hard fast rule by any means, because I haven't looked at every class combination, and I own most of the source books, but I don't own every single book. For example, this Mythic Odysseys of Theros is one of the Magic the Gathering uh, influenced setting influence based book that I do not own, although I do want to pick it up because it looks very interesting. But that's an example of how wide open it is in terms of that. And so my plan was to have everybody pick a traditional character, but it didn't turn out that way. I didn't expect to have two creatures in the party, but that's how it worked out. So I learned to be that's a possibility, and you got to prepare for that. The other thing that came up a lot was the fact that the players were asking me as a DM if they could roll for persuasion or use their skills or roll. They almost wanted to roll for everything. And I had to kind of tone it down and say, there's some things that you don't have to roll for, like kicking a door or, mundane things that you don't really need to check to have a strength check, for example, or, I mean, you can depending on the situation, but not in every single instance. So, I found that to be come up more than anything else where characters are suggesting as part of the role playing, excuse me, as part of the role playing and situational circumstances, requesting to if they could make some rolls um, that they wanted to make for their skills.
So I think, in conclusion, or to paraphrase, or to summarize, there are some hints that I learned, or rather, there are some lessons that I learned. Excuse me, I learned DMing today, and I hope to pass along some of these hints. Maybe you already familiar, but maybe it will help you if you're running your own session in the future. Um, One thing was that, like I was saying, the PCs will ask of you more than any other. I don't know. I guess it depends on the game and the group, of course, but more than anything, they will ask if they can use some of their roll for some of their checks, some of their skills, like do a persuasion check or a dexterity check or any type, depending on what they're doing. Sometimes rolls are not necessary, and you sort of have to. You don't want to curtail their creativity, so you will agree for them to have them roll, because rolling the dice is fun. It's part of the game, and it's a lot of fun. But and it makes the players feel more engaged. But you want to kind of curtail them doing it in too much, if that makes sense. That's one tip I would say. Another thing I would say is have if you're running a prepared campaign, or we used to call them prefabs, or prefabricated, like a module basically. Don't run it straight uh, text straight for the box. Basically, kind of put your own spin on it. What I did is I sort of wrote a very short introduction, kind of a pre-adventure, if you will, because some of the NPCs were not really fleshed out to begin with, and especially the relationship between the NPCs and the characters. And so I would say, sorry, I was getting a call. What I was saying is the relationship between the NPCs and the players may not be fleshed out, and you want to go ahead and do that, and then sometimes you have to put your own spin or write that into the campaign. And the other thing is be as flexible as possible, because you don't know what they're going to throw at you. I had this whole session face by face planned out, but it turns out that they were really enjoying getting to know the other members of the party and interacting with one NPC in particular. And then the creature characters, which were a little bit more experienced players, were doing kind of their own thing. The Satyr wanted to do things, but don't be afraid to take away a little agency. By that I mean there was a point where I had one of the characters just uh, magically appear with the other characters at a different location because I wanted them to be all together, and I gave an in-game reason for that. But that's kind of cheating a little bit, a DM trick, and don't want to overuse it because you don't want to take away from player agency. But you can do it if the narrative warrants it, as long as you do it sparingly. I think. What do you guys think? I want to know if you allow unorthodox, non-player, non-traditional race class combinations into your games and how do you incorporate them. I want to know what you feel about some of the tips, especially what I just talked about, taking away player agency for narrative or for to move to progress the story or to progress the campaign or the adventure, and anything else you want to bring up. So, thank you. That's all I have for today. Thank you so much for watching. And if you like this type of content, go ahead and hit the like as usual, like and or subscribe. I do have a Patreon set up, but it doesn't get a lot of love, and I don't push it. So, if you want to support it, you can. Or I will have the link in the description. And that's all I have. Keep on playing. I will keep sharing some tips or experiences as a new DM, and hopefully, you may the rolls be with you.